So the title I actually owe to Kate from 2 weeks ago, when she'd said during her seminar, which I thoroughly enjoyed towards the end, saying, is anyone at JCU working on wellbeing and ecosystem services? And I thought, actually, there's quite a few. And in fact, when you look at it, you start to think, and I was thinking about the PhDs and postdocs and people I've co-supervised with over the years, and we've all been working on various topics and various issues, but there's a lot who are coming at this whole issue of ecosystem services and well-being from lots of different angles. Now, of course, you guys know a lot about Christina's work, so I'm going to step out of that one off on the side, and I thought what I might do is give you a bit of a roller coaster ride and a taste of different things that have been going on from different perspectives with the rest of us as we go through, focusing primarily on what the PhDs and postdocs have been contributing, figuring the other people are old enough and ugly enough to look after themselves. So it's back to, I suppose, the first question that you'd always get on these things of why would you even want to value the environment in the first place? And, I suppose some of the reasons, and one of the main ways that people look at it when they say, oh, we want you to do evaluation. And I would start by saying, why? Why do you want to put a number on the environment? Oh, we've got to make sure people know how important it is. I think, okay, fair enough. And so you get the Access Economics report where people wander around and say the reef's worth $4 billion a year or whatever. It's actually not all that useful as a management information, though. It's a lobbying tool, but really having a single number to say the environment's worth X amount, I'm not convinced is all that useful. In terms of, from a management perspective, though, where it starts to get more useful is when people want what we talk about as marginal values, when they want to use those in terms of assisting information about trade-offs. So instead of all or nothing, this is the value of the environment and it's here or it's not, it's a matter of saying, how is the environment impacted by development systems? How much are we giving up? So they're the trade-offs, so the marginal values that the economists would talk about. And it's also quite useful to provide assistance to people who might be trying to design some regulatory schemes or market-based policies saying, oh, we're going to put a tax on carbon, or we're going to put a tax on nitrogen use in farms or whatever, and we want to work out what that tax rate should be. And in an ideal world, you set the tax equal to the externality to get your nice Begovian tax. Or you might try to be able to start setting up schemes where you're paying people for providing an environmental service to say what's the value of that service to be able to start getting some equity and things there. Now, that's all well and good, and there's bucket loads of methods for trying to estimate the environment, and the list goes on and on and on, and they get more and more complex as time goes by. Needless to say, it's like almost all statistical methods and things that they're far from perfect. And in fact, a lot of research is showing that when you get people who are working in managerial positions, part of the reason they're not using economic valuation studies is because they actually don't trust them. They're a bit sceptical, or they don't understand them, or they're a bit worried about it, and so they'll go back and use the biophysical indicators, which are a nice supplement, but they'll often sort of push the economic stuff to the side, mainly because they haven't got enough confidence in what's coming back to be able to say, I'll make a decision on this, I can't cover it. Now, that's all well and good, but sometimes just deciding not to put the value in there means implicitly people are putting value of zero on that, and that can have some pretty undesirable consequences on those things as we go. So, in fact, there's this whole sort of almost a factory of trying to use economics to come up with different valuation frameworks, and there's sort of, as you talk about economics and the utilitarian approach, then it's all this idea that, utility is a satisfaction that we gain from consumption of a good or service. And of course, the thing I really love about this is that as far as the economists are concerned, since 1930, there was no reason for even discussing this idea of utility because everyone knows you can't measure it. And there's this wonderful YouTube clip that you can enjoy that's got Ronald Coase discussing with Gary Becker, and they're going to have an argument about whether people are utility maximisers or not. And of course, the argument starts by them unanimously agreeing full-heartedly, well, of course you can't measure how happy people are. You can't measure this thing called utils. So in fact, it's only supposed to be a theoretical construct. And everyone's agreed with that since 1930. So the economists have gone off on their own, knowing that utility can't be measured, and devising all these really complicated systems for measuring value, even though value is supposed to be underpinned by satisfaction, knowing that you can't measure satisfaction. They wonder why people can't understand their methods. So as I said, they sort of devise these fancy systems that are actually embedded on the idea that you can only order preferences, that people can only tell you whether they prefer one thing to another, but they can't tell you how happy they are. And so I've shown this one before in different contexts. I normally have little pictures of people, but I figured I better put fish in place instead when I came here, where you sort of start looking at what makes people happy. And so they have this utility function, and you go out and you identify all the components of the utility function, and then you actually decide that you can work out all these trade-offs between these combinations of different components of the utility function, and they construct their experiments or the choice modelling experiments to say at what point is someone indifferent between two baskets of goods. And in this case, the person I found is indifferent between having $100 and reef fish or having $1,000 and no reef fish. So you can conclude that reef fish are worth $900. So that's supposed to be the measure of value, and that they get around without ever actually having to count happy faces. They just need to know that they're equal. I've sort of put them in there just to remind us that that's really what's going on. Well, now it may surprise you, but there's some social psychologists and some other disciplines in this world, and the psychologists have been working on this whole issue of happiness and utility long ago, for a very long time, while the economists have been assuming you can't just ignoring it. The social psychologists have been going away, and they've actually become pretty good and have developed numerous different scales and ideas for being able to try to measure how happy people are or how satisfied they are with life. And they use 4-point scales and 10-point scales and 5-item, 7-point scales and all these different sorts of things. But in fact, there's beginning to be this growing consensus that actually these guys have got it pretty well tagged. They're not that silly after all. They might not be economists, but maybe they know a thing or two. And even the economists have picked that up, and there's some really quite nice literature that's beginning to say, oh, hang on, if we can actually measure utility directly, then maybe we can actually start using that within evaluation systems and being able to use it more so as it goes through. So what it is in terms of the sort of mathematics or the structure of it is it's now saying we don't have to do those choice experiments or the choice modelling to get at these values. You can go away and get some objective measures of how happy people are, and then you can collect some other data on other factors that are known to influence life satisfaction or happiness. You can whack that into an equation, use some statistical techniques to be able to estimate the marginal coefficients, and then compare the ratios of those to start saying which factors are contributing most to happiness, and you can even do the ratios of one on the other to generate numerical estimates of what those trade-offs are, so that you can go through all of those. So the key for all of this is, of course, working out what factors other than environmental things go into these life satisfaction equations. One of the best ones that comes out of this, of course, and this is because the psychologists have been working it for so long, is apparently about 50% of the difference in terms of how happy someone is in their quality of life is related to genetics. So for all of you who have young children and you say that really what you want in life is for your children to be happy and healthy, stop wasting your time getting them richer at education. Just go find yourself a spouse who's happy. And then you can actually go through and do all of that. But those are the sorts of things that are tied up in those ones. Now, what this means is that the benefits, if you can do this, is you can get round all those sort of pitfalls that are associated with a lot of the standard evaluation techniques. You don't need to worry about the hypothetical bias, strategic bias, etc. You don't have to worry about the one person, one vote stuff. If you can actually measure cardinal utility directly, then all of a sudden all these other tools that economists have been playing with in other areas become available to you. So if any of you played in economics, they've got these production functions which conceptually look very similar to indifference curves, and all of a sudden you've got this whole range of different techniques that open up that you can start exploring and playing with, and you can start looking at incorporating these values into other models in other more sophisticated ways. So what I thought I'd focus on today is saying that you can really only do that if you can get this equation right, because otherwise you've just got your little dribbles on those as it goes through. And so part of what we've been toying with in different ways is, which ways of measuring life satisfaction are going to be best for the purposes of evaluation. We're not coming at it from the same angle as a social scientist. what sorts of factors should go into this utility function when you're going away and estimating it, how are you going to measure the different factors that are going in there, how are you going to deal with the interactions that might be going on, because it is a sort of complex system for doing that, and other extensions. So the standard life satisfaction is using it in the statistical measure, but other insights and other ways that we can sort of push the boundaries to get more information out of this as it goes. So in terms of the different areas we've been working, a lot of this, we had Sylva Larson initially working in the Cardwell Shire and the Whitsunday Shire. Aurelie de Leeds spent many months living on the islands in Torres Strait. We've had Adriana, as you know, playing over in Costa Rica, and she's also been working with some data in northern Australia. We've had Xian wandering around China, annoying people and asking questions there. We've had Cheryl wandering around the Philippines, asking lots of people about how happy they are there in the context of flooding. We've had other studies when we were sending out mail-out questionnaires to residents in the north about social and cultural values. We've had people being harassed through the rainforest, where we've been asking Indigenous and non-Indigenous residents and tourists. We've had lots of tourists and residents across the GBR being harassed as well. So it's been a lot of years and a lot of context wandering around, basically looking at this link between ecosystem services and wellbeing. So a lot of the time we actually focus on the left-hand side of the diagram on the ecosystem service. And really where we're focusing is on this, trying to get this utility function right, which is looking at how would you comprise and measure this overall measure of wellbeing, and then what are the different components and how would you actually look at the relationship between them and the way things contribute to those. So first up, given the complexity of it, it's actually not surprising to find that when people first start talking about wellbeing, there's a large group that's looking at using objective measures of wellbeing, and so they're trying to grab the constituents of the factors. So you get the ones who say, I'm going to look at income, or I'm going to look at physical health or financial security as those have been components of wellbeing. You've then got people who would instead decide that they might focus on subjective measures of wellbeing. So the ones I just mentioned first up is those global indicators of wellbeing, how happy people are overall, how satisfied they are with life. But then you also get people working at components of the satisfaction with particular domains. So how happy are you with your income? Remember the first time I put that question in front of an economist, he nearly had a fit. He said, that's irrelevant, it's how much income they earn that's important. Well, actually, it could be how happy they are with their income that matters. So you've got those different perspectives of those that happen. You can also have a little bit of a debate on whether these domains that we go to measure when we talk about wellbeing are ones that are actually selected by someone else, normally the wise men from the south, or whether we actually have them selected by someone else and then perhaps actually weighted by individuals, saying, oh, okay, well, you might put that, but I think one is more important than the other, or whether you get individuals deciding which domains of wellbeing are actually most or least important to them as they go through. So those are the sorts of issues. Now, one of the ones which Xian was doing, which was really quite fun, so she was wandering around in China and she'd start the questionnaire, and I believe you were starting with the 5-item 7-point Likert scale, asking people how satisfied they were with different domains of their life and different aspects. Then spending a while harassing them about coal mining and how they felt about all of that, and wrapping up the questionnaire at the end with just how happy are you with life overall. And of course we thought that thinking about coal mining for a little while would make them really miserable, and that you would end up with different responses to it depending upon the way you structure the question or where you put it in the questionnaire. And in fact, when you start looking at the answers and comparing the way and the patterns of responses across those, this is very aggregated data, of course, but the first thing that's coming to mind is this thing that it's actually getting similar patterns. It's not so much the way you're asking the question, and if you're trying to do that, the patterns of the questions, depending upon what scale you're using, are very similar. And we get the same if we're working with 100-point scale, 10-point scale, 7-point scale, 5-point scale. I think the 100-point scales are probably the nicest to work with because you do get a little bit more fine-grained detail on what's going on, and the closer the scale you get. But the sorts of patterns of those things are similar. The other one we were getting, and this is one with Silver, where she was saying, okay, well, I did some literature review on what domains people might want to talk about when they're saying what makes them happy, but then I'll run some focus groups in local areas to be able to see what some regionally relevant ones are, and then I'll ask people in questionnaire format to say, well, here's some ideas about what might make you happy. On a separate piece of paper, I want you to actually go to the effort of sitting down and writing out which ones are most important to you and then weighting them. So that was an interesting way of trying to be able to select those ones. And of course, there were quite big differences across which ones were going, although the most common that people were picking were in the social domain, in the relationships with people, as coming up as being those of the highest priority, the well-being, when you were letting them self-select as they go through on those. We're also running these ones where we gave them large questionnaires. So this was one out of our rainforest survey, where instead the items were provided to people and they were asked to do it. We randomised the order of the items when we put through the questionnaire so that you weren't getting just people picking the top items to do that. And we're getting these very sorts of similar stories to the messages that were coming through with Silver's earlier work, is that it's all about keeping families safe and roads and hospital, and it's these social factors which come up quite high in those. We then get a lot of the environmental factors which are coming in there that are focusing, and it's not until much further down the list that you're getting these opportunities to earn money from mining or earn money elsewhere as it goes through. So those sorts of patterns we've repeated, and we've got them in the GBR study and elsewhere. Xian was also getting similar sorts of studies in China, where she was again asking them to rate different items on the scale to see how important these different factors were to things. Again, getting high agreements on things like personal health. Everyone was thinking that was very important, so further out on the radar is more important, and there was broad-scale agreement, not much divergence across regions for those. Lots of things about the importance of having good relationships with family. And where the differences were arising were on things like air quality, on how important that was to overall quality of life, on things like fairness or income inequality. So there were this indication that you're going to need a broad range of domains in these utility functions, that the social stuff, there tends to be fairly broad agreement on those, and you get into other areas and the disparities are beginning to arise on those. So, the other way we started to look at doing is looking at the ratings that people were giving on importance, and then using statistical techniques to tease out which ones were coming up as being most important or not. So, of course, in this one, what we're doing, we're looking at non-use values in the GBR, so the aesthetic values, the knowing we have healthy reefs, the knowing we have good, healthy fish and mangrove systems. And all of these people were rating them as very high in their importance scale. They were getting higher ratings than productive values in the ecosystem area. But in fact, within that group, the males were giving them generally lower levels, and those with a lower education were also giving them, the higher education were giving them higher ratings on those. Now, this one I find interesting when you look at the decision makers within communities and the makeup of corporate bodies and the makeup of political cabinets, and you start to turn around and say, if there are these recognisable patterns in socio-demographic groups in terms of their priorities or values, where they might be making decisions, then in fact that's actually quite interesting. We also find that when it comes to looking at recreational use values, so that's another type of cultural service, then in fact the males are putting higher priority on that. That's in this area, the fishing and the boating. The fishermen amongst you will recognise that, the less educated. And surprise, surprise, those associated with industries that are very using the environment for productive services are also those who are placing higher values on using the environment for recreation. And those, when you're looking at using the environment to be able to earn money out of it, we find that it's the people who are already on high incomes who have those as high values, which of course gives the question of the chicken and the egg and all those types of areas through there. Regional differences are also really apparent. So this map was actually one done up by Diane Jarvis when she was looking at trying to construct the determinants of life satisfaction for people using geographically weighted regression through there. The picture is actually showing the different regions that we're getting different coefficients on the, and statistically different coefficients within those regions. So we find that as you go from down south in the Townsville area, you can see Palm Island and Hinchinbrook there, the people who were living in that area were generally getting more satisfaction out of their income than as you went further and further north, income became relatively less important to the people living in that area. The corollary to that one is that the thing that became more important to people in living in that area was having more control over their life. So I think some of the people who really want to do things and live life their own way, living up north of the Daintree, and this is certainly coming up as the sorts of values that were going there. We're also picking that up very strongly in the GBR, so in a larger geographic area, and I've spoken about that one before, those patterns of finding that income is relatively more important to people in the south, and the further north you become, the more important do non-use values start to come. It is a pattern that's emerging through there. And Adriana is picking up some of that in her earlier studies in Costa Rica, that there are these differences in patterns, that people in the rural areas, again, are having a smaller contribution of income to their life satisfaction than others. So again, the sort of intuitive thing you might bring for that, I guess, is I think if I valued opera more than anything else in the world, Townsville would be one of the last places I would choose as a resident. You really want to go to live in a place that has those values. So it may well be that what's actually we're observing is that people are self-selecting their place of residence according to some of the environmental attributes that are actually being given. But we do need to look at that as we go through that in more detail. The Northern Australia data is confirming that even with the land managers, the people are turning around and saying, well, you know, money is much more important than lifestyle, although since Tony Abbott came along and they were wishing I'd never used that word again. So we now know that's a little bit of a dangerous one to pick. Okay, so in terms of coming back to this initial focus on those, in terms of how you would measure life satisfaction if you want to get a utility function for the purposes of valuation, probably doesn't matter much. If you're wanting to use it for other purposes, you might have to have much more nuanced measures on those. But, you know, going with the 100-point to 10-point scale, how happy are you with life overall seems to be pretty robust for these purposes. In terms of picking which factors to go into the utility function, it's pretty clear that you need to pick on multiple domains, that they're just picking GDP as an indicator of welfare is a pretty lousy approach to going about and doing that. That there's a lot of other things that matter, most importantly the social stuff, and in some regions the environmental stuff is much more important. May need to be looking at geographic indicators and potentially looking at including weights on those things as it goes. So the next question would be, well, okay, we want to pick up something out of each of those domains or out of a variety of domains. How would we operationalise this and go and collect data in the real world to be able to get stuff into a utility function? Subjective or objective indicators, as I said, you know, do you ask people how happy they are with the air quality, or do you actually measure air quality in a handheld monitor? And so again, we had Shyam was wandering around with the air quality monitor, picking things up through China while asking people how happy they were with the air quality. And there's a good correspondence between those. You can find that the people who are most satisfied, that's measured on a 7-point scale, so it actually goes up to 3, but the happiest people are the people who have the best quality air quality in terms of the lower number of PM 2.5 particles in the air. And the people who are most dissatisfied with air quality are the ones who actually do indeed have the lousiest air quality. Now, there's not a direct correspondence between them, but it's actually giving an idea that subjective measures might actually be pretty good in some cases. So we're running all sorts of different models as well. And so one of them that Diane Jarvis was playing with was looking at tourist satisfaction overall. She's also done this on resident satisfaction, but similar conceptual ideas in terms of what makes a tourist happy with their overall trip. And Having more income and more expenditure obviously makes for a better trip. Longer visits, going out to the reef is really nice. Making sure there's not a construction site next door to your motel is generally a good idea. Holidays are much nicer if it doesn't rain, unless you come from Townsville when you wish you had more rain. We found that water turbidity, so AIMS gave us access to the data for all the water clarity, and Diane matched the water clarity at different sites at the time at which each tourist was visiting to all of those types of things to pick them up, and people were much happier if the water was clear, whether it was because it was pretty or because they weren't so scared about what might be in it if they got in it, we don't know. The temperature was they like it being warm but not too warm. It gets much over about 29 degrees and they start to go downhill again, and that comes up with residents. But then we're also picking up this really fun subjective measure. And this is one Bob Costanza has told us to recommend we threw in as being a really good indicator of social capital on those. And it comes up in everything. One of those ones where you want to go back and say thank you for making sure we put that in. And we had just a subjective question. Do you think your wallet would be returned to you with all contents intact? And this came up as a really strong determinant of satisfaction. It had no correlation whatsoever with actual crime rates in the region, and actual crime rates had no impact on satisfaction at all. It was people's perception of safety that was the biggest driver on those ones. So again, it's beginning to pick up that, there's sometimes these objective measures are going to matter, but sometimes the subjective measures are going to be much more important. And again, reiterating that in Adriana's one, it wasn't actual income that was driving the land managers' satisfaction across the north. It was whether they were content with the income they had. So they weren't income maximisers. All right. The other interesting one that we're picking up is that relativity matters. And this was one, I tried to run through my PowerPoint. I had to put this in for Georgina. She kept talking about this in her presentation yesterday. Let me just see if I can swap to here. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this before. And I know you can't hear this properly. But what it is, he's talking about an experiment that was being run on monkeys about the equality of pay. And this is one reported many years ago by Sarah Brosnan. And what they were doing was they were grabbing monkeys who lived in a colony together and oh, it stopped. Yeah, so they were living in a colony together, and they were giving them tasks to do, and one of the rewards they could get was cucumber, and the other they could get was grapes. And so they had to give a rock and you'd get a piece of cucumber back, you'd give a rock and you'd get a grape back. And they really prefer grapes. Monkeys have a very strong preference to grapes. So they started this experiment by actually giving the cucumber to one monkey who would be happy to do this task 30 times over and over again. They kept giving them. And then they put that monkey in a cage next to one who was asked to do the same task and was actually given a grape instead. So I'll see if I've actually managed to time this. There you go. Okay, so that's the one on the left is going to get the piece of cucumber, and the one on the right is the one who's been given the grape. We'll just pause while it spools. Okay, there you go. That's the cucumber. Oh, that's the rock, and they give them the piece of cucumber. And this one gives them a rock. The one on the right, yep, gets the rock. And that one's now been given a grape. And you can see the other one watching that. They have to give the rock, and now it gives them a piece of cucumber. and that's all that happened. Now I keep doing this when we talk about the fact that, the equality matters. It's not just the warm, fuzzy feelings only. If you're a businessman and you want your workers to be productive, you obviously have to worry about this pay packet that or they may well spit the dummy as it goes through. Yeah, I'm sorry. I knew, yeah, exactly. Well, okay, so we've got this sort of thing happening, and Cheryl was exploring that when she was looking at the data she's collecting in the Philippines, where she's been trying to find out how badly flood affected different households were in terms of their monetary damage, the depth of water, or the psychological trauma that they did through those. And she was actually assessing how much they were impacted and how much other people in their immediate neighbourhood were impacted, to then try to look at those measures within the utility function. And again, she's got Brosman's monkeys in there, that when people are impacted by flood, you can pick up the magnitude of that impact. You can compare the ratios in there, and they're coming up to being approximately equal to what you'd expect in terms of the financial losses. But if they're the only house in the street that's affected, they're actually much more miserable as it goes through. So that's an interesting one when we then go through to start looking at factors. Now, another way that people often look at well-being is they might say, well, I'm going to work with subjective measures. It won't all be objective, but I'm going to start with domains that someone else has selected, so that I'd say 90% of research on well-being, you have the experts from somewhere else deciding which domains we should look at, and then it's actually put in there. And you simply go out and ask people how satisfied they are with those different domains. So in this case, what we were actually doing was we were asking people how happy they were with different domains. Again, the further out in the circle, the happier they were. Now, if this was all the information you were using when assessing your wellbeing function, the insight you would probably get to this is to say, oh, I might be a little bit worried about industry. I think when I want to get re-elected, I need to focus on the importance of the economy and getting that going, because people are less satisfied with that than anything else. Well, in fact, if you compare the satisfaction levels that people are reporting with the importance levels that they're expressing in terms of how important those things are to the overall level of well-being, you tend to get a very different sort of story. And this is stuff coming out of the marketing literature that's saying it's not just how satisfied people are, it's how satisfied they are with the things that matter to them. So it's all well and good to say, oh yeah, the roads are fine, but it doesn't matter, I walk everywhere. You know, why would bad road conditions be there? And so it's the sorts of things where if the thing that's most important to you is your family, then in fact being satisfied with what's happening with your family will probably be one of the most important determinants of whether you're happy. And being satisfied with road condition may not actually be all that important at all. The other thing we find, though, is that as you go from group to groups, these gaps, or these measured gaps between satisfaction and importance, tends to change. So we were running this experiment in the wet tropics, and Michelle was pulling up data saying, what's the gap between importance and satisfaction for tourists? And they were all pretty content. You know, they were on holidays, they were having a good time, and everything was pretty good. They started to look at the gap between satisfaction and importance, particularly on the environmental angle, which is where it's showing up here, and this was also in the wet tropics. And the people were less content with the residents. You then look at the gap between importance and satisfaction for the Aboriginal rainforest people, and the gap was much larger. So again, that theory of relativity, it's not just relative to other people, it could be relative to previous experience or to your own expectations when that's happening. So, with those, we could say you need multiple domains if you want to construct a life satisfaction function with geographic indicators. You're probably going to need a mix of objective and subjective indicators. There's not going to be any hard and fast rules, and you're probably likely to need some relative measures in there, whether it's inequality or relative to past history or to expectations or to importance. We also know there's going to be lots of interrelations between these factors. So in this case, Michelle was actually working with some qualitative data where we've been asking people about how satisfied are you with your overall quality of life, and then asking them why, just to give a one-liner. What was it that was so good? So the sorts sorts of responses were along the lines of, I live in a beautiful environment, I have a wonderful family, I love my job, and was going through to be able to start working out the associations between which words and concepts were being used most often with those. So again, what's coming up through here is that there is this little bit of a mix between, wanting the healthy family and friends, and that's part of the whole community sense of those. And then it's also this interplay between the beauty and the environment and being able to enjoy it. So that access rights is always an important one when you talk to people. And can you enjoy the environment? A lot of it is actually, can you get at it? So there's relationships there. We could then explore some of those relationships in a more rigorous way, where you could start to say, maybe we won't just use qualitative methods, we'll use quantitative methods. So Aurelie was, as I said, she'd spent many months on and off living on Mobiag and St. Paul's Island, asking local people about the different important factors that were contributing towards Indigenous hunting. And so the sorts of factors that people were identifying as being important to their hunting were things like being able to maintain culture, providing food, and there was a range of different things, 18 different items that were all thrown in. And then she was looking at them and thinking, a lot of these seem to be related, but this is terminology, so I don't want to actually just change the terminology. So she went back and put each of those items on a card to get a pictorial representation of that, and then was using cognitive mapping exercises with people to say which ones are grouping together. Now, this one I like to show, the main point is that in this case, there were very distinct groupings of the sorts of values that were coming. It didn't matter which community, so in here it was St. Paul's and here it was Mobiag, you were getting similar factors grouping together. And in fact, the sorts of things were happening is these were all related to the market. It was how good the food was, that it was a cost-effective way of feeding the family. These sorts of factors were related to community and culture and supporting those. And these were all about sort of individual prowess or individual health. So those factors were grouping together. Now, what this means is that if you're trying to construct some of these utility functions, you may not have to have a zillion lists of items to scale there. It could be that getting at that broader conceptual level of satisfaction with family relations, etc., could be enough to then actually make sure you have a broad overview on those, depending upon your research question. The other one you're going to get, though, is even if you're able to group factors together to say these are similar different aspects of the same life domain, I don't have to have 100 items in there, there may be interrelationships between the different areas. So, in fact, what we were finding is that some benefits are actually making people happy directly. So people actually are happy at night just sleeping better, knowing that the Great Barrier Reef is safe and healthy. But at the same token, having a safe, healthy, happy Great Barrier Reef is also of benefit because it supports recreational activities, it supports Indigenous culture, it's supporting tourism and commercial fishing as well. So there's actually multiple ways in which these things are entering into life satisfaction and utility functions with those interactions within. Okay, I'll skip that one because I think it's going there. What we get there is in terms of just putting in your factors and saying, here's my life satisfaction, and then there's my items that I go in there, and I'm just going to enter them in a regression equation and run them, is clearly not going to be enough. There's going to need to be the pre-analysis, the grouping of the factors, the hierarchical structuring of what's happening within them to pick up the nuances within there. But you can actually get to the point where you can do other things without constructing a life satisfaction function. So, for instance, we were the very cheeky ones who'd said, well, if this is the structure of people's utility function or their happiness function within the reef, and if we know that people are happier with these things being most important to their overall quality of life, and that these are more important than reef tourism, and if we know that reef tourism is worth $4 billion a year, then each of those separable items must also be worth $4 billion a year. So you can be very cheeky to say, this reef's worth a lot in terms of those ones, as it goes to. Okay. The other sorts of ones is this asking people, how would your life change if that happened? You don't need to go through to be able to quantify them into life satisfaction equations if you can't get every variable in them. But you do need to be careful to rely on the fact that if managers are trying to use this in decision-making context, what's most important to them is the relativities. They're making decisions and trade-offs. So in fact, what we were finding useful is to ask people how their quality of life would be affected by things relative to another baseline that governments like to work with. They like money, they like prices. So by actually putting in this type of question, it's saying, we're able to say, well, people are stating that they would be more freaked out by environmental degradation than by price rises. And so you don't know exactly how much it is, but having that relative information may well be a way of being able to provide guidance to managers and ideas to be able to work with them. And again, getting these measures of perceptions on those, Xian was looking to be able to pick up people's perceptions on how mining was going to impact their quality of life. So the earlier data is how important these things were to overall quality of life. And in fact, we're finding that the things which are most important to them are the ones which seem to be getting the biggest impact on those. So that's, again, another way of being able to start to look at this to say, oh, is this a good or bad thing? Instead of just focusing on money and saying, oh, okay, mining's going to make everyone rich. But it's a matter of saying that's relatively unimportant and the other impacts may be there instead. So I might stop at that one there in terms of just the concluding bits, that the empirical insights that we're getting here are very much that you get these non-use of cultural services are going to be much more important than a lot of productive services across the northern area. But there really are these very significant differences in terms of the value systems of people across regions and time, which has really quite interesting implications in terms of the political economy of who's making decisions about which regions where. We also tend to get this idea that the life satisfaction approach is likely to be a viable alternative to the valuation, but you do need to make sure that you've got a full range of indicators. It's not just looking at one or two, and it seems clear that you might need to start weighting factors as it's going through. As Christine has been saying for a long time too, but the cultural services and the ecosystem services, they do really need to be separated into the non-use versus the recreational use values when you're doing those and talking. And again, these aggregating some services and the need to use nested utility functions. But we can also learn a lot indirectly, and just being able to put a dollar value on stuff may not actually be the most useful technique. And if you haven't got the life satisfaction function right, in fact, it might be misleading, and we might be better off with the indirect information.